Chassidim came to the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe should say Chassidus, whatever it was, on this or that. There was more than one such request. And on one of the occasions when the Chassidim came to the Alter Rebbe and they asked the Alter Rebbe for Nayas, they wanted to have Maimorim on Kabbalah or whatever it was, the Alter Rebbe says in Yiddish, Gazetten darf dir, Gazetz, jede Tag frische Nayas. You need newspapers. Every day you need new news. Learn Tanya. Alter Rebbe said, learn Tanya. Gloib mir. Alter Rebbe said, gloib mir. As von Tanya can man werden a chosed as wie Avraham Avinu. Alter Rebbe said. If you learn Tanya, you can become a chosed like Avraham Avinu was a chosed. This is the Alter Rebbe said about his own sefer. Learn Tanya can werden a chosed as wie Avraham Avinu. And of course the story of the Alter Rebbe and the Tanya, how did the Alter Rebbe know? So the story was Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, and he spent 20 years writing it. It was Medag b'chasav v'yesed, as we know. Then when the Tanya was published, they found the Alter Rebbe learning it with Iyun. So I don't know who it was. It must have been the Tzemach Tzedek, but you don't know for sure. And said to him, Rebbe, you learned Tanya? You wrote the Tanya? So the Alter Rebbe answered, Ich zeh do med nayes v'mizrich. I find in this sefer that I wrote more news than I heard from my Rebbe in Mizrich. In other words, the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, and after he wrote the Tanya, he learned the Tanya. And when he learned the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe discovered what the Eibishter gave him. You know, the story with the Hillel Paracher. You know the story of the Hillel Paracher? The Rebbe told the story more than once and twice. And the Rebbe told the story in such a way that it was l'shvach. You know, the Rebbe was very intolerant for people who were smarter than the Rebbe. You know, the idea of his kashas by the Rebbe was more than with earlier Rebbeim. But nevertheless, the Rebbe did tell this story about the Rebbe Hillel, that the Tzemach Tzedek said, "Amay Chassidus." And then there was a Chazorah. And by the Chazorah, there was an argument of what was the Pshat. The Tzemach Tzedek's children held one way, and Rebbe Hillel held a different way. And Rebbe Hillel would not back down. Rebbe Hillel was a Deya. Rebbe Hillel was older than the Tzemach Tzedek's children. He was just 7 years younger than the Tzemach Tzedek himself. So they went and they asked the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Tzemach Tzedek sided with his children. They didn't tell him, you know, your son said such and your chassid said such. They told him these are the two Deyas, and the Tzemach Tzedek agreed with his children. So they came back to Rebbe Hillel and said, okay, so now you have to at least concede that you made a mistake. He says, I refuse. I'm still going to stand by my Deya. So they said to him, what does that mean? The Rebbe, the source of the Maimer, says that you're making a mistake. So the Hillel Paracha said famously, when the Rebbe says Chassidus, when the Rebbe says Chassidus, the Eibush is speaking through his lips. And after he says the Maimer, he has the same chiyuv of Talmud Torah like anybody else. He understands it his way, I understand it mine. You understand? When the Rebbe says Chassidus, it's Shechinu Daber, it's Eibish's word. Shechinu Daber is the Gerene. Afterwards, he has the same obligation as I do to learn Torah. He understands it his way, I understand it mine. If it would have been any chassid but Rebbe Hillel Paracher, the Rebbe would not have suffered. Rebbe Hillel was unusual. Even amongst the great chassidim, he was unusual because he was very great and he was very makusher. Rebbe Hillel, apparently, I mean, we're mevinim, you're talking about the giants, but Rebbe Hillel, you know, all we have is the Rebbe. All we have is to do what we're told. That's all we got, because there's nothing else. But these were people, you know, you get Lenin, you get Davenin, they were daily Yisrael. But Rebbe Hillel, apparently, the idea of Rebbe was deeper than by the others. You know, the famous quote that Tzemach Tzedek said, that Rebbe Hillel is half Rebbe. Not half a Rebbe, half Rebbe. There's a very big difference saying half a Rebbe and half Rebbe. Half a Rebbe means there can be many Rebbes and he's a half, you know. Half Rebbe means half of him was the Tzemach Tzedek. In other words, his kashas was incredibly deep. So for him it was honest. It was not a stira to his kashas to say that I'm learning the Torah of my Rebbe because the Eibishter gave me a chiyuv to learn this Torah and this is how I understand it, so this is my day, even if the Rebbe disagrees. In the Lashon HaGemara, Torah he v'lilma da need tzarech. Torah doesn't verstehen. Torah is supposed to understand. So the Alter Rebbe learned the Tanya after he wrote it. And he said, I find in the Tanya more news than I learned by my Rabbeim and Mizrich. Now Rabbi said, we're starting Perek Chafalev, a new Perek. And I guess for us, that's a Shechayanu, V'kimanu, V'kiyanu. At the pace that we learn Tanya, we can make a siyam after every Perek, like the little kids make in the first grade. Perek Chaf, and it's right in the middle of a conversation. That's the truth. It's mamish in the middle of a shmooze. The conversation that we're in the middle of is this conversation about Achdas Hashem, the unity of God. Right? The Alter Rebbe began the previous Perek by discussing Anoichi v'layir lecha, the first two mitzvahs, Anoichi Hashem alakecha asher tesicha meret Mitzrayim beis avodim, and layir lecha l'kem achenu upon this is the mitzvah saseh and the mitzvah leis saseh, connected to Achdas Hashem and Avodah Zarah. And the Alter Rebbe says these two mitzvahs we heard from the Eibishter himself. All the other mitzvahs we heard from Moshe Rabbeinu. These two mitzvahs, there's a Gemara that says this. These two mitzvahs we heard from the Eibishter himself because they're. The Alter Rebbe explains why. The entire Torah is Anechi and Le'yir Lecha. So these two we heard from the Eibishter. The other Tov Reish Aleph mitzvahs we heard from Moshe Rabbeinu. The Eibishter gave over to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu repeated it to us. And this will be discussing Achdas Hashem. And if you came to the Shiurim in the past period, you know that I explained to you that there's three levels of his bonanus. There's three types of meditations, contemplations. There's a level of contemplation which is called Mamale Kol Almin, that just like a soul gives life to a body, the Eibishter gives life to the world. And in as much as the Eibush is giving life to the world, he's serving the world. There's a world, and Hashem gives it life. Then there's a higher madrega of his bonus, which is called Seviv Kol Almin. And this bonus Seviv Kol Almin says, Yahalu Shema Deshem, Kiniska Shmei Levad, Heida Ledes V'Shamayim. Which means that the investment of Hashem in the world is almost nothing. It's not nothing, it's almost nothing. From the perspective of Seviv Kol Almin, the whole investment of the Eibush in this world is only a little bit, the ha'ara. So the Eibush is creating the world, and he's invested in the world, but the measure of his investment is very small. The third is bonus, is what we call in Atzmus Amos, this bonus in Eibush himself. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, or in this Maimer, Ani Havaya Leisha Nisi, in this Tanya, Ani Havaya Leisha Nisi, that on this Madrega, you don't say that the Eibush is invested completely. You don't say that the Eibush's investment is very little. You say that there's nothing but God, that there's no world. So I presented to you in these classes our learning of Achdas Hashem as follows. That in Perek Chaf, in the previous chapter which we completed, the Alter Rebbe discussed Achdus on the middle level. Alter Rebbe didn't say the world doesn't exist. The Alter Rebbe said the world is created from a word. How much is a word? If you compare it to how much a person could speak, and you compare it to how much a person could think, and you compare it to how much a person could feel, and a person could reason, and a person could will, and a person could delight, and then compound that by the fact that we're not talking about a person, we're talking about Hashem, and that Hashem spoke one word, Ki B'Ka Havaya Tzorei Lomim, with the two letters, Yud and K, David should create the whole creation. So you're not going to say the world is nothing, right? Right? But as they say in all the Torah, it's nothing worth. Nothing worth is Yiddish, it's not English. Not, it's Gonishvet. In English it's worth nothing. It's virtually nothing. It's almost nothing. This is what we learned in the previous Perek. But in this Perek we're going to go to the higher level. In this Perek we're not going to say the world is insignificant, the world is almost nothing. We're going to say the world literally is not. Literally is not. As you understand, and as I explained, the meaning of the word Achdos Hashem does not mean there is one God. The meaning of the words Achdos Hashem does not mean there's one God as opposed to Chas Hashem two. That's a stupid idea. It's a silly idea. Achdos Hashem means there's one God and there's nothing else, including us. You understand? Achdos Hashem is really about the world. The idea that Hashem is one is the first mitzvah. That's knowing what God is. If you understand what God is, you understand there can only be one. Achdos Hashem, the second mitzvah, which the Rambam words liyachadoi, to make him one in our mind, is the understanding that we are it. That there's nothing besides for us. Ein eid mulvada, besides Eibush, that there is nothing. So the idea that the world is insignificant, is almost nothing, is a madrege in Achdus, but it's not the highest madrege in Achdus. The highest madrege in Achdus is that the world doesn't exist at all. Even though to us it feels very real, very actual. So let's start Rabbi Isai, Perek Chaf Aleph. V'hinei. Midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Eibishter's measure Kvayochel, is Shalai is different Kemidas Basav Adam, the measure of a person. What's the model? What is the model? What is the form? What is the model? In these two chapters, chapters 20 and 21, the model is Hashem created the world with words. Hashem created the world, He creates the world with words. He speaks, and the world comes into being. The idea of words. More specifically, again, if you were here in the Perek Chof discussions, there's two parts to words. There's the sounds, and then there's the amplification of those sounds. There's the sounds that come from the 5 sources of sound: the throat, and the palate, and the tongue, and the teeth, and the lips. And then there's hevel, the air which comes from the lungs, which is called in Chassidus, but they see b'shaynos, air that comes from the heart, even though it doesn't come from the heart, it comes from the lungs, but it's called air that comes from the heart. And the air amplifies the sound. It blows against the vocal cords when we speak. And you can hear. There's a combination of sounds and voice. Koil goes on the hevel, on the air. And according to Kabbalah, koil is made up of emet, eish, mayim, ruach. It has no offer. That's why it's considered ruchnius. Keil, marav, reich, ein, mamish, in haloch. So the koil, the air that a person blows on his vocal cords in order to create sounds, is the other half of speech. So which is higher? The individual sounds, or the hevel, or the air that you blow from your lungs to produce audible sounds to be able to hear them? So this depends which maimah you look at. One maimah will tell you that the air is like a neshama and the sounds is like a goof. And another maimah will tell you that the sounds are like a neshama and the air is like a goof. The different sounds, that's the spiritual, the tsura it's called. And the air is called the chaymer, it's the substance, it's the power behind those sounds. So if confusion is your thing, I'm happy to confuse you. If confusion is not your thing, try not to worry about it. But in the previous Perek, we spoke about Hashem creating the world through speech. And that speech consists of a tsura and a chaymer, a neshama and a goof. The sounds and the hay. The air which blows against the vocal cords to produce the various different sounds. Dibur. And Hashem speaks, and He creates the world. Why do we use the metaphor of speech? Why do we use the mashal of speech? So there's a simple reason why we use the mashal of speech. When a person thinks, his thoughts remain inside his brain. They never separate from the person. So if you would describe Hashem creating the world with thought, like it says in Zeir, the world as Hashem creates it from thought continues to be after He made it, like before He made it. Because just like thought in a person, the thoughts remain in the person's mind, in the person's brain, the metaphor, the mashal of thought would connote how Hashem is creating the world, but the world is inside of Him, how the world is one with Him. And I mentioned to you that before the Eibishter thinks, we would call the world Ephes. After the Eibishter thinks, we would call the world Ayin, but you would not call the world Yesh, which means separate. That's why creation is not described as will or thought. Creation is described as speech. Hashem spoke. Vayemer Elokim Ye'er, Vayemer Elohim Yekir Akir, Vayemer Elokim. What's the Lashon HaPasuk? Yehir Akir, what's the new? Yikov Amayim Mokom Echa V'Terah Yabosha. Vayemer Elokim, Tachi Oretz Desha, Vayemer Elokim Yehima Oires, and so forth. That when Hashem speaks, He creates. Why? Because just like when a person speaks, the words go out of the person and they go to a place where the person isn't. So they came from inside the person. Both the tsura, that means the sounds, and the chaymer, that means the air, came from inside the person. And they radiate from inside the person to outside the person, and now they're separated from the person. This is why speech is the ideal mashal of creation. Hashem creates the world through speech. He took something which was in Him and He placed it, so to speak, in a place where He is not. So now you have to ask me a question. Isn't it better to describe creation as action? Why describe creation as speech rather than action? So the Nekudas Abiyah, the point of the answer is, by Hashem there is no action. There's only speech. We have thought, speech, and action. Hashem has thought, speech, and speech. He has two different types of speech. The second type of speech is called Dibure Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Choshev Maaseh. The words of Hashem that are considered a deed. There's two steps. There's a step called thought. There's a step called speech, where the Eibishter, so to speak, puts the world outside of himself. And then there's a second step, which is called Diburish HaLaKadosh Baruch Hu Choshev Ma'aseh, the speech of Hashem, which is considered a deed, which is the idea of his slapshus koyach apel benifal. Hashem invests himself in the creation, and he makes the creation be. I'll explain it to you in a moment. Now, why is there no action by Hashem? By the Eibishter we say, just like by a person there's thought, by the Eibishter there's thought. Even though the Rebbe is going to bring in the Maimer, you cannot compare Hashem's thought to ours. Big Chiddush, I wouldn't know it if the Rebbe didn't tell me. Yeah. Similarly, you can't compare Dibur of Dibureinu, you can't really compare his speech to our speech. But nevertheless, we describe creation as speech, so what would be wrong to describe creation as action? And there's a simple and logical answer. If creation consists of a gufa and a neshama, a chomer and a tzura, when I speak, the sound comes from inside of me, and the air, the material, the substance, the hevel, the zeya of the speech comes from inside of me, right? What are the words of action? What are the words of action? If I write, those are words of action. If I carve, those are words of action. So I have an idea in my mind, which I attach to ink, which I put in a piece of paper that didn't come from my mind, it came from someplace else. The ink is not inside of me, the ink is separate from me, and the ink, I dip my pen into the ink and I'm able to write letters. So what would it mean that Hashem does action? What would it require, so to speak, for the Eibush to do an action? The answer to that question is, for the Eibush to do an action, he would have to go to a store and buy supplies and build with them. The Eibush doesn't have any stores to visit. Why? He's everything. He's everything. So you cannot say Hashem does an action, because an action means that the person takes something from his mind and connects it something from which is outside of him to create a certain gestalt, a certain wholeness. Like, for example, writing words using ink and a piece of paper. By the Eibush, there's no such concept. So therefore, by Hashem, there's no concept of an action. But there's a concept of speech. Now, for the Kabbalists keeping score, and you're all Greisa Mekubalim, like I always say, as long as nobody knows, we're big experts. One person actually knows that all become Greisa Maratzim. So the Rabbi will all big Mevinim, yeah? What's the difference between the first type of speech and the second type of speech? The word is a Poshet Hazach. When Hashem creates the world through speech, that means he separates himself. Correct? Now understand, I'm standing here and I'm talking to you. The air radiates from my lungs through my vocal cords and it comes out to you. Yeah? When the Eibishter speaks, where do his words go? Where do his words go? On the highest levels, there's Bechlal no space. Bechlal no space, yeah? On the lower level, you can say that there's space. There's no place where he isn't. So where do the words go? You understand? I'm speaking, so the words are leaving my lungs, hitting against my vocal cords, my metoy sapets, coming out, it's going to you in a different spot. But if the Eibush is everywhere, or to say it, if there's nowhere, there's no here and there, Bechlal, there's no mokim, where do the words go? And the answer, of course, is tzimtzum. He removes himself. So speech by the Eibush is backwards. Not he pushes the words out of himself. He removes himself. There should be room for the words. You understand? Hashem's speech is inverse. It's the same idea, but it's backwards. Not I push words out of me, I remove myself. So there should be a place out of me where my words could be. And that's why there's two steps. The first step is Hashem removes himself and he creates a space for the words to be. And then he invests himself in those words so that the creation should happen proactively. You can't create anything through a negative action. Going out of a room doesn't accomplish anything. Investing yourself in that room accomplishes something. So tzimtzum, which is dibur, is Hashem removing himself. It's a negative action. Negative actions don't create positive things, they create negative things. So the third step is called islapshus keach apel benifal. Hashem invests himself in the creation. Or diburish HaLaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem puts himself into the world. And in Kabbalah it's called the kav. So by you and me there's thought, speech, and action. By the Eibush there's thought, speech, and a second time speech. Because everything comes from him. But getting past that, creation is compared to speech. The Eibush created the world. How do I know creation compared to speech? Because there's an old book, of the Maaseh, with the Rogatchover and the Reb Chaim. They were go'oinim, they were chaverim. They learned together by the Reb Chaim's father, by the Beis HaLevi. But they were very different personalities. The Rogatchover was a very breiter mensch. And Reb Chaim was a very metzumtzum. He was like brisker. He's a via voice brisk. Everything's focused. But in certain ways, Reb Chaim says there were different personalities. They were friends. So the story was that Reb Chaim and the Rogatchover were having a debate in correspondence. As they get the Maisa, that the Reb Chaim wrote a letter to the Rogatchover to argue his case against what the Rogatchover was taining, and he wrote, Mitzasi b'sefer Yosha Noishon v'chumish shmei. I found in an ancient book a source for my position, and the name of the book is the Chumash. As if the Rogatchover knew the whole Shas, he forgot to make the Chumash. The Rebbe Tamal gesagt, I think. Yet the Rogatchover quoted a pasuk in Chumash, and he wrote a Maramokam, a Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Rogatchover. But b'chol eifen, the Torah says, Vayomer Elokim, Hashem creates the world through speech. And this is the reason why, because the concept of creation is to create not ayin, which means a world that's bottled, is to create yesh, a world that in its own feeling, in its own hergish, is separate from the Eibush, as attached to the word yesh. So the process of creation is to create something that's separate from him, and the metaphor for separate from him is speech. In the two steps, the first step is he removes himself, and the second step is that in that space where Kvayachal is no longer, he reinvests himself to push something into being that should be Kvayachal in its own experience, removed from Elokus. So creation is compared to speech, or to say it more wholly, creation has two steps. First, Hashem thought, and when Hashem thought, the whole creation happens in one instant. You know this, right? That it says in Midrash Chazal. This is the Mishnah Pirkei Avos. Basorim Amoros Nivra Elam. This is the Pirkei Avos of this coming Shabbos. The Eibush created the world with 10 utterances. V'alei b'maimer echad yachal yibaros. Hashem could have created the world with one maimer. So the Rebbe Rashab has a maimer in Ranat, and the Frierdiker Rebbe has it in Tafshin Daled, I think, where the Rebbe Rashab brings some different svarim from the Medrash Shmuel and from the Ramak, I think, that it's not an either or, it's both. Hashem created the world twice. He created the world with Maimer Echad, with one utterance, and he created those utterances with 10 utterances. And there's different Nefanim in Kabbalah, which is first and which is second, which is higher and which is lower. But what's important for us is that first is Maimer Echad. Before Hashem created the world in 10 utterances, he created the world in one utterance. And this is called thought. And according to some deists, that's Bereishis Nami Maimeru, Bereishis Bar Elokim et Maimer Haaretz. Is in some opinions, not in all opinions, in some opinion it's called the 11th utterance. The one which is before the 10. That in one thought, Eibush made the whole creation. But the way the world existed in that one thought, it was one with Hashem. So to give it to you a context of time, this is called the Shabbos before Sunday. There's two Shabboses. There's the Shabbos before Sunday, and there's the Shabbos after the Sheshis Meibreishis, right? We come in Pashas Bahar. I don't know if you noticed, Pashas Bahar begins with Shabbos, Shemitah, and it ends with Shabbos. The last pasuk in our Pasha is Shabbos again. And in the middle of all the halachas of Mekach Memken, where do you have in Chumash all the dinim of buying and selling? Kinyonim, Baba Basre, not Baba Kameh, not Nezikin. The halachas of commerce is not in Pashas Mishpatim, it's in Pashas Bahar. People don't realize Pashas Bahar is, from a yeshivish perspective, very lumdish. Pashas Bahar and Pashas Mishpatim are the most important pashas in the Torah as far as Chesed Mishpat is concerned, business. But it starts with Shabbos, it finishes with Shabbos. Before you do business, there's a Shabbos. And when you finish business, there's again a Shabbos. That the business should be the way the business is supposed to be. So there's a Shabbos before the Sheshis Meibreishis. And there's a Shabbos after the Sheshis Meibreishis. The Shabbos before the Sheshis Meibreishis is called Machshava. Hashem thought before he spoke. In some places, by the way, this is called the creation of Nisan before Tishrei. Right? We hold like Rabbi Eliezer that the world was created in Elul Tishrei. Right? Rosh Hashanah was the 6th day, so the world was created Chaf Hei B'Elul. But there's a Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah who says that the world was created in Chaf Hei Oder. So in some places it says that in Chaf Hei Oder the world was created by Machshava, in thought. That the world is one with him, and then 6 months later, Chaf Hei B'Elul, the Eibishter began to create the world on a level of speech that it should be separate from him. So there's the idea of Maimer Echad, the whole creation is in one thought, and then the Eibishter Kvayachol removes himself, creates a space where he is not, and into that space he invests the world, and this is called Ba'asora Ma'amores Nivra Ha'olam. Hashem created the world with 10 utterances. And this is how Chassidus explains the event of creation. That the Eibishter creates a space where he is not. It's called Tzimtzum. And into that space where he is not, he puts the worlds. Now, I plan to say this, but I'm sort of shocking myself as it's coming out. This is very, very intense. I feel like it's very intense. Maybe it's clear, but it's a lot. So let me just give you another angle, okay? I'm giving you another way to think about what I said. I'm repeating myself. That's all I'm doing. But I'm hoping that by repeating it a second time, I'll make it easier for you to understand what I'm trying to say. There was a fellow's name was Arizal. You heard of that Arizal, yeah? Ever heard of that Arizal? Arizal. Everybody talks about the Kabbalah of that Arizal. We all forgot about the Kedusha of that Arizal. And that Arizal was a Oived Hashem. Like you and me. He davened, and he put on film, and he gets in kosher. He was a servant of Hashem. He was the ultimate servant of Hashem. The biggest tzaddik is not the biggest mitzias. The biggest tzaddik is the biggest nish mitzias. Kol sho yesek amer yesek Allah. That Arizal. But the Arizal was a neshama she'en kamayit. The greatness of the neshama that is unimaginable. We can't imagine what kind of neshama it was. What kind of mind he had. The Arizal used to say that I cannot write. And in order for me to speak, I have to condense my thoughts with great, great intensity to be able to give you a trace of what's going on inside my head. And this is Kisvei Arizal, which is impossible to read because the whole thing is written in code. The verstehst. The Arizal's moichin was ain't safe. The Arizal is the source of this concept in Kabbalah, which is called Tzimtzum. The Ramak, the other meaning at Tzimtzum. If you look at the Maimorim that Marash brings, that Be'emes have Makeres for Tzimtzum in Zohar also. But the classic Hasidic position on a scholarly level is that the inventor of the idea of Tzimtzum Arishan was Arizal. Before that Arizal, there was no such concept. And there's the whole discussions about what's an Afkamina Lagabi Yalakus between the Ramak Shita and the Arizal Shita. Now it's not the time to go into it, and frankly, I don't understand it at all myself. But in any case, the Arizal invented the concept of Tzimtzum. What's the concept of Tzimtzum? The concept of Tzimtzum is the Eibush wanted to create the world. So he removed himself from a space, and in the space in which he removed himself, he created the world. Right? Everybody heard that expression, right? Godliness finished all of space. And then the Eibush created he removed everything from inside this eagle, inside this circle. And in that empty space, Eibush was able to create a place to put the creation. Now, what's the Arizal really saying? In other words, what's missing in this statement that's so important to point out? Because without it, the Arizal's words don't make any sense at all. They really don't make any sense. What the Arizal is really saying is that you cannot have a world without first having space, makom, and time, zman. We don't believe in relativity. Potato doesn't believe in relativity, absolute. Zman, atzim, makom. Time is separate, space is separate, and matter is separate, not like Einstein. The Rebbe has a letter about this. And Hashem doesn't have time. Hashem doesn't have space at all. So there's no concept of here or there altogether. So when you read the beginning of the Eitz Chaim and the Sharak Domus and the Bevesha Orim and the Eitz Chaim, all of those Svarim that quote this classic expression, that Ein Seif Malach Malcham Achol, with Ein Seif everywhere. When Kisha'olabert saying the Eibush created a world, so he created the eagle and he drew the Ein Seif out of the eagle, out of the ball, the empty space. Whatever, there's different expressions, but that's the basic idea. What's that he's really saying? That before there could be a world, there had to be Makam. So before Tzimtzum, Hashem created the world. That's what the Rizal is really saying. Before the Eibush created Tzimtzum, he created the space. But the space was filled with him. So the Chiddush isn't that Hashem was everywhere. The Chiddush is that there was a where. You understand? If there's no where are you going to put light? There's no place to put it. So the real novelty of Tzimtzum is not the Tzimtzum itself, it's what comes before the Tzimtzum. But the Eibush had to create space. But the way he created that space, that it was filled with Ein Sof. And then he removed the Ein Sof and left over the space. That space is called the Mokim Lamidas Elam, as we put the world, and that's the speech. The two steps in the speech. Step one is took away the Ein Sof. And step two, into that space, he reinvested what we call in our culture a kav, to create the ruled worlds, a higher world and a lower world, a first world and a second world, a deeper world and a shallower world, etc., etc., etc. So the Arizal's real chap is not the Tzimtzum, it's the Mokim. Once you have Mokim, you could say remove you yourself. And this is the understanding of thought and speech, you understand? What Hashem thought, He created a world. Where? In the space. How did the space get there? When the Eibishter thought, He created the space. When the Eibishter thought, He created the space with the world inside of itself. And then He spoke. What did He do? He took away the light and left over the space. Left over what we call the Eisiyas Hareshima, the building blocks of creation. And then He brought the Kavan to create the world. That's thought, speech, action. So what's thought? Really, thought makes everything. The Eibishter made everything in thought. Afterwards, it's just window dressing. It's just steps. It's just hishtalshalos. Hashem thought. When the Eibishter thought, He created the mokum, the space, and the zman, the time, and the world. But it was all one with Him. It was all one with the Ein Sof. That's called machshava, thought. And to use the words I used before that thought, the world is in a state of efes, garnished. And after that thought, the world is in a state of ayin. Ayin means we don't understand. Not it's nothing, we don't build imus, we don't understand what it is. After the Eibishter thought, and in that thought He created the time and space and the reality of the world that is one with the Ein Sof. Then He removed the Ein Sof, that's called dibur. When the Eibishter separates Himself, that's called dibur. And when the Eibishter then reinvests the kav to force the worlds to be what they're designed to be through a pro-action, through a positive action, rather than through a negative action. This is the second step of speech, which is called diburish ala kadosh baruch hu choshev ma'aseh. Hashem's speech is like an action, but we cannot say by the Eibishter ma'aseh, because the Eibishter didn't go to any supply depots to buy the materials for the creation. He took it from Himself. Okay, so now I'll be quiet and I'll let you ask questions or make observations or breathe. Wie wilt. I'm just warning you, if you have nothing to say, I'm going to go to the Beidik. It was clear. It was very intense. It was a lot of information in a very short time. But this is Aleph base. In the terms of Chassidus, this is very, very elementary. The machshava is that the space is full of Him, and the key here is the mokim. The mokim. If you learn Sharichet V'Amunah, where the Alter Rebbe is arguing with the sheet of Tzimtzum Kipshutei, he says, you forgot your common sense. Hashem is lamaylu migedem mokim. Hashem left the space. There's no space legabe Him. The whole thing is mikar leisa. But okay, that's a different discussion. So Rabbi said, where are we going from here? Now that we understand, that we interpret the Chumash, al pi Kabbalah, al pi Chasidus, that before the Sunday of creation there was a Shabbos. And on that Shabbos, the Eibishter thought. And when the Eibishter thought, He created the time and the space and the reality of the world. Now it's one with Him. And then when Sunday came, He removed Himself and left over the world, and He pushed the world into being Sunday and Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday. And then Shabbos is Aliyah. The whole world has an Aliyah. So where are we going from here? What are we going to now add to this? The answer, Rabbi Say, is this idea that's called Tzimtzum Shaloi Kipshut. You ever heard of that? Tzimtzum Shaloi Kipshut. Tzimtzum Shaloi Kipshut. Let me explain to you what that means, okay? I'm going to go back to the beginning, right? There was a Yid whose name was Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luri Ashkenazi. He was a boss of Adam who lived on this earth that was Mamish Vesach Alisa Lamerem Shavisa Shevi. Yitzchak ben Shleimed, the Neshama of the Arizal had no business in El Mazeh. Shimon ben Yechai, Alisa Lamoram Shavisa Shevi. You bring some Neshamas into this world. The Rebbe said about the Friedrich Rebbe, Yosef Yitzchak ben Shalom Ber Shtain Nesara, Alisa Lamoram Shavisa Shevi, Shin Beis Yud. Some Neshamas don't belong in this world, B'Klam. And there's no question that the Arizal, Yitzchak ben Shleimed, is Shevi backwards. And the Neshama came into this world, was Mamish Alei Be'erach the world, and it was Magal Seder Satera. He gave us oyer, Torah oyer, the Chochmah, Torah Hashem, at the level of Ein Sof, level of light. And that Arizal invented the idea of Tzimtzum Rish. And again, I just explained to you the critical component of Tzimtzum Rish. I think this is very, very important. I do this for a living, I get paid to teach Chassidus. So you can start asking if halachic I'm allowed to get paid, and we can have a discussion about that at a different time. But that's my job. I teach Chassidus. So I've taught many people, including teenagers, these ideas. And of course, when it comes to young people, it's very important to give them a way to hold it. I always start with the same conversation. You cannot begin to understand the Tzimtzum unless you appreciate the concept of space. Makam. Hashem has no mokum. Hashem doesn't exist in time. Even the Rambam says it. By the Eibishter, there's no mokum, there's no zman. Mokum is anivra. Mokum, time and space are creations. So in order to understand the Arizal idea of Tzimtzum, you have to first understand what's the Arizal idea of mokum. One of the most critical components in the creation is creating not the world, but the space for the world to be. Mokum. And Tzimtzum means the Eibishter created that space. But he created that space, how that space was one with him, what we call it a level of machshava, a level of thought. And then he removed himself and left over the space. So you probably know. We're talking about Tzimtzum Rishon. Yeah, classic. Right. So when the Eibishter initially created the Mokum, he filled that Mokum. And then he removed himself from the Mokum and left a cholol and a Mokum Pone. Now Rabbi say, this question of Tzimtzum became a big part of the Machlokes Chassidim and Misnagdim. And it was very volatile. The Chassidim called the Misnagdim apakursim for their Shita and Tzimtzum. And the Misnagdim very readily returned the favor and called Chassidim apakursim for their Shita and Tzimtzum. Because it became very personal, became very intimate. Because the idea of Tzimtzum, which is a Kabbalistic, philosophical, mystical idea, actually is a very religious idea. A very religious idea. In other words, it has to do with our lives as Jews and our faith. And the Chassidim and Misnagdim were split down really extreme lines. Not on the philosophical level. I mean, philosophy came in Schlafen Banacht. Philosophy, theoretical issues don't bother anybody. It's when they become personal. The issue of Tzimtzum had a component which made it very personal. And it resulted in the Machlokes Chassidim. Like we see the Beryl Levin, so Zayin Gesund, the Rebbe's librarian, published Alter Rebbe's Igros Kodesh many times. And every edition is better than the edition before. In the most recent edition, he did something very special. He didn't only publish the Alter Rebbe's letters. He published the Makbilos. Wherever he was able to find, he published the letters of the other people to whom the Alter Rebbe is responding. So you get a historic picture. And there's a lot of people whose letters involve the Alter Rebbe directly. They meant Levitebsker, Ram Kalisker, and others. And in the back of the book, he publishes the letters and the comments of other people which help you understand what the Alter Rebbe is saying. And he also prints notes from the Vilna Gaon, from the Gra. So you see the contrast in Alter Rebbe and the Vilna Gaon on the question of Tzimtzum Rishon, which was a very volatile part of the Machlokes Chassidim Misnagdim. In other words, it wasn't a theoretical, philosophical, mystical debate. It came down to religion mamish. But here's what you need to know further. There was nothing new about it. The Alter Rebbe and the Gra, the Baal Shem Tov and the Gra argued about the question of Tzimtzum, but every position that they took existed before. They didn't invent the argument. They took positions on it. The Rebbe, the Rebbe, with his incredible encyclopedic knowledge, in his Rishimas on Tanya, in Sharich Edmuna Perek Zayin, lists the names of the people and the Sfarim in Kabbalah that bring what amounts to 4 different shittas about Tzimtzum. Most of those Sfarim and most of those Machabim, you never heard of them. Just to give you 2 names, the Knessia Plesi, that's Abyenis Nebishitz, agreed with the Vilna Gaon about Tzimtzum. Beklolos, but Pratius I don't know. The Mishnah Chassidim, the Emmanuel Chayriki, agreed with the Vilna Gaon about Tzimtzum, or the Vilna Gaon agreed with him about Tzimtzum. So understand that the Machlokes between Chassidim and Misnagdim and Tzimtzum was not a new Machlokes, but they made it personal. It stopped being academic, and it became religious, and it became a dogma, it became something to make a pulmos, make a war about in the world of the Chassidim and Misnagdim, but they really were not creating new positions. They were simply adopting positions from the Kabbalah from the generation before, 2 generations earlier, but they translated it into religious life, and then it became very personal. Okay, so let's talk about it. That the Rebbe has a letter, a short little letter. That short little letter, if it was written by anybody, the Rebbe would be a book. But it's mamish 2 amudim, And there's a history to this letter. We've talked about this in the past. The history of this letter is that there was a Yid who lived in England whose name was Rabbi Yossi. He was a very ehrlich Yid. He was a beautiful, beautiful Yid. He was a Litvak. He was what we call a Misnagid. He was a Yerei Shamayim Rabbah. He was a very, very wonderful Yid. His son lived in Cleveland, in Telz, and he was Rosh Hashiva in Telz. His name was Reb Nachum Dessler. And Reb Nachum Dessler has letters to the Rebbe about the Rebbe's correspondence with his father, Rabbi Yossi Dessler. Rabbi Yossi Dessler wrote a Sefer of Musar, which is quite popular in the Yeshiva Shavel today. I'm not going to say it's the most popular Sefer, but it's very popular. It's called Michtav Me'Eliyahu. It's 2 or 3 volumes. Michtav Me'Eliyahu, I've seen this for him. If you look at the footnotes, every Marmokim is Tanya, Lekut Teira, Derech. It's so interesting. But he was Mashgiach in Gateshead. It's one of the strongest Litvish yeshivas in Europe. He was a big Yerei Shamayim. By them, the Mashgiach is like of the Mashpia. You understand? The Mashgiach is the tzir, the Ruchni is the Ketzir of the Yeshiva. He was a Mashgiach. He gave Murtzah Drashas, and he wrote Sifrei Musar, Michtav Me'Eliyahu, and he met Rabbi the Masmid, who was the famous Chabad Chassid, and he was overwhelmed. He was overwhelmed. But he met the Rabbi the Masmid. He said, if this is the Chassid, I can only imagine what the Rebbe is. That was his spoilers. And he knew other Chabad Chassidim. He knew Rabbi Yitzchak Dubov, Olav Shalom, who was a Rav in Manchester. And he also knew Rabbi Rachmiel ben Yominson, who was a Chabad Chassid who lived in London. And because of this, he began to explore Kabbalah. And he also began to explore the roots of the Machlokes of the Chassidim and Misnagdim about this question of Tzimtzum. And he concluded that there's no argument at all. And he wrote letters. It's printed. These letters are printed in each of the Matzmid Sefer. Years of Ayetzah. There's a book about each of the Matzmid's life. In the back you have these letters. And I understand, and I'm not an expert on the subject, I understand that the reason he came to that conclusion is because he was learning the Sfarim of the Talmud of the Gra. The Reb Chaim Volozhin, the Nefesh HaChaim. And the Rebbe writes that there's no question that Reb Chaim Volozhin saw the Tanya, and he was influenced by it, and he disagreed with his Rebbe. He disagreed with the Vilna Gaon, and it seems that part of the reason Rabbi Yossi Dessler misunderstood, and he said that there's no real machlokes Chassidim and Misnagdim, is not so much because he was learning the Torah Sagra on the question, because he was learning the Torah of the Talmud of the Gra, who really was influenced by the Tanya and went much closer to the sheet of the Alter Rebbe. So he started asking questions. He wanted to understand. And the Bishop of the Masmid answered him. The Bishop of the Masmid's letters are printed. Ich möchte schwer verstehen seine Briefe. Ich verstehe nicht der Goynes. The Bishop of the Masmid was a God Neulam, who's an incredible God, but I read his letters. I don't understand what he's trying to say. It came down to an impasse. In other words, Rabbi Yossi Dessler said, I read this for him, this is my opinion, show me where I'm wrong, and no one was able to show him where he is wrong. So the Frierdiker Rebbe asked the Rebbe to step in, our Rebbe, who was living in Paris. And the Rebbe wrote a short little letter to Rabbi Chmiel ben Yominson. It's one of the first letters in Igris, one of the first letters in Igris Kedish, Mamish, for Rabbi Yossi Dessler. It says, Mareinu harav Yud, and Yud is not Yitzchak Masmed, Yud is Yerachmiel ben Yominson, who was living in England at the time. The letter is genius, but the letter has one huge drawback. The Rebbe does not quote sources. He simply presents a thesis, and the Makoides are missing. In the Rebbe's Rishimis, in the Rebbe's journal, all the sources that could be in this letter are available. But the Rebbe did not include sources in his letter. You could explain it more than one way, and one of the ways of explaining it is, had the Rebbe put sources in the letter, he would have confused it. He wanted it to be crisp. It's very crisp. And the Rebbe presents, he said, I got your letter, and I don't understand how anybody could say what so-and-so said. That all the shittas are going in one direction, because there's 4 shittas about Tzimtzum. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Reb Nachum Dessler, Reb Yehu Dessler's son, who lived in America, wrote a letter to the Rebbe after the Rebbe was already Rebbe. And he writes to him that the letter he wrote to my father is incredible, but it's very concise. Would the Rebbe develop it? The Rebbe is something more elaborate. And the Rebbe said, and the Rebbe wrote him some sources, really from Chassidus. He didn't bring the 4 shittas. But the Rebbe wrote a letter flushing out 4 shittas about Tzimtzum. I'm not about to give you 4 sheets about Tzimtzum. I didn't come here to confuse you. It's not my job. I may do it, but it's not what I'm paid for. You understand? I don't get for then that's all extra. So I'll try to be crystal clear. I'm going back to the beginning. Okay. What is the most important word in today's class? Space. Mokoim. The Eibishter created space. That's a chiddush. Hashem doesn't have space. And the whole question of tzimtzum affects the space. And Arizal says, now that he created a space, he was able to evacuate. He was able to go away from that space and leave the space empty in order to create the world. And this is where the argument becomes. Tzimtzum kipshute, tzimtzum shalei kipshute. When Hashem created the space, and Arizal writes explicitly, the Eibush that evacuated the space, is he taken not here? Is the space empty from Hashem? Is Hashem taken not here? Yes or no? So again, in specific, there's 4 shitas. Tzimtzum kipshuti and oid, and tzimtzum kipshuti and mod, tzimtzum kipshuti and oid, and tzimtzum shlei kipshuti and mod, tzimtzum shlei kipshuti and oid, tzimtzum kipshuti and mod, tzimtzum kipshuti and oid, and mod who is galus. Those are the 4 shitas. Okay, if you didn't follow, don't worry. I just had to say it. I know it from the letters, so I'm just repeating the Rebbe's words. Brilliant, it's so crisp. The Rebbe's letter is very crisp, very clear. The basic question is, when Hashem created space and evacuated space and the world should exist, is there now a space where Hashem isn't? So from an angle of creation, from an angle of the Haskalah of Kabbalah to explain creation, it's a brilliant idea. But from an angle of Achdus Hashem, it's a very controversial idea. Do you mean to say that Hashem created a space and He's not there? And that's what happened by the Chassidim and the Misnagdim. The argument was around probably for 50 years, maybe even 100. Right? The Arizal passed away in Shin Lamed Gimel, right? Which means today it's 450 years ago. The Baal Shem Tov passed away more than 250 years ago, right? The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidus, lived, let's say, 100 years after the Arizal, 150 years after the Arizal. So the Arizal's Toidas were first being cultivated and developed and analyzed and opened up. So the Machlekes was probably 50 years old, or maybe more. But the Talmidim Darizal, Talmidim began to debate this question, and they argued very respectfully about Tzimtzum. One said Tzimtzum Kipshute, and they didn't kill each other. The Misnagdim took the position of Tzimtzum Kipshute, and again, I mentioned to you, the Mishnah Chassidim and Rabbi Yankiv Emden were both in the sheet of Tzimtzum Kipshute. Do not misunderstand. G'dei Yisrael, even in Kubalim that we include in our Chassidus, went in the sheet of Tzimtzum Kipshute. But what happened by Chassidim and Misnagdim is they asked the next question. You mean to say there's a space where God isn't? Well, they took it to the religious level, to the Achdus Hashem level. The Kabbalistic explanation of creation, in as much as it's Kabbalah, hurts nobody. But now comes the question, what about Leisa Sarponim Minei? What about the idea that there cannot be a place where there isn't God? This is a Zohar. Eineid Mulvade. And this became very personal, became very volatile, because the Misnagid accuses the Chassid of being apakatis for one reason. The Chassid accuses the Misnagid created for the opposite reason. The Chassid says to the Misnagid, is the Eibishter in this world? Is the Eibishter in a Mokum Tomei? Is the Eibishter in the church? Is the Eibishter in the Beis HaKisei? And the Misnagid says, Chas v'sholem. Hashem is going to be in a dirty place. Hashem is going to be in a filthy place. Hashem is going to be in an evil place. And the Chassid says to the Misnagid, you're okay for being a kid. Apakatis, how can there be a space on the Eibishter? I said, the Misnagid says, so you hold Eibishter in a bathroom and even in a church? Of course. Apakatis. How could Eibishter be in a Mokum of Ashpa? So it became personal, not because of the debate itself, because how they translated that debate into the question of Achdus Hashem. The Gra writes for Fedish, it's impossible to say that Hashem is a Mokum Atinefis. You can see it in the Alter Rebbe's Igris Kodesh, that when the Rebbe has letters in Igris Kodesh, in the back, the Rebbe, he brings quotes from the Vilna Gaon, from his original pen. Not from his Talmidim. He wrote himself in the debating the issue with the Alter Rebbe. They never met, as we know, the story and the history. But he argues that you cannot say Hashem is in a Mokum Atinefis, in a filthy place. So that the Misnagdim putting Hashem into the garbage can is Kfira, and to the Chassid Eibush not being in the garbage can is Kfira, a Milchama. It was a war. And the beginning of it is space. The Rizal introduces to the idea that Hashem created space, and that in this space there was a possibility for a world. But in order for the possibility of the world to become an actual world, there needed to be this phenomena called tzimtzum, the evacuation of space. The question is, tzimtzum kipshute, tzimtzum shalei kipshute. Is the evacuation of space literal or figurative? Did Hashem leave the space, or did Hashem just make it impossible for us to see Him in this space? Is He still here and we cannot see, or is He mamish not here? There's more details to the debate, which I'm not going to go into now, but that's the debate. Basically, the Misnagdim scream that when Hashem made the tzimtzum, He removed Himself from the space, because the space is dirty, not good, unclean, hepech ha'kedusha. And the Hasidim said, of course Hashem didn't remove Himself from the space. If the Eibusha removed Himself from the space, there wouldn't be space at all. It can't be. The Eibusha has to be everywhere. Hashem is everything. And this is I'll get to the question in a moment. This is the background of the debate about tzimtzum. Now, I'm going to let you speak in a minute. But I just want to say what I just said in the words with which I started the class. The Eibusha created the world with thought. What does that mean? He created the world, that the world is one with Him. But when you say one with Him, you mean in that space. And then after the Eibusha thought, He spoke. What does it mean He spoke? He removed Himself. When you speak, the words go out of you. When Hashem speaks, He removes Himself, so the words should exist outside of Him. Everything is backwards. Because He's everywhere. In fact, it's not He's everywhere. He's b'chlal not inaware. But in as much as He created space and He fills that space, Hashem's space is inverse, is backwards. He removes Himself and leaves over the space. That's why you have the two steps. He removes Himself so there should be the space without Him, and then He reinvests Himself to create the world proactively rather than through an inaction. So the question became, when Hashem spoke and He filled this empty space with His words, are those words outside of Him? That's the question. And that's what we're going to begin to learn now in Perek Chaf Aleph. Go ahead, but talk loud.
My question was, not believing.
Their issue was the Hashgacha Pratis. Their position on Achdus was not that the world is God, but that the God who governs the world. And the truth is, you could say that that's Shitas HaRambam also. Their Achdus consisted of the fact that they believe that Hashem controls everything in the world, even Klippa. But He controls it from a distance. Because their issue was, the Rebbe in his letters, and I remember the Rebbe talking about it, more than once, on Chaf Yellow, a few years in a row, the Rebbe talking about it. The Rebbe said, Al Pi Seichel, the Shita of the Vilna Gaon makes more sense than the Shita Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe said that. The Shita of the Misnagdim actually makes more sense. The problem with the Shita of the Misnagdim is not that they hold the Tzimtzum as Kipshute. The problem, the Shita of the Misnagdim, is the reason, the Nimuk. They hold the Tzimtzum is Kipshute because Hashem cannot be in a dirty place. And you can't say about Hashem, He can't. The Shita, if Hashem wants to separate Himself from what He could, the Hasbara would not be Seichel, be Nimna Nimnois. The creation would exist higher than Seichel, because in Seichel there's no way for that to be, because, like the Alter Rebbe said, the Shechet Namuna, if you create Yesh Maya, you have to do it b'chol rega v'rega. They had a different concept. But their Achdus was because of Hashgacha Pratis. And that's adequate. That's the Rambam Shita in Achdus. Hashem is Mashgiach and Hashgacha Pratis, even on Klippa. But He's not there. And the Chassidus takes a higher idea, Achdus Hashem, Ein Mulvade. Ein Mulvade means there's literally nothing besides the Eibishter. So therefore, in the Machlokes of Tzimtzum, we held Tzimtzum, Shalei Kipshute. But it's interesting, there's a Machlokes that existed before, so peaceably, became so personal, because they didn't just study it on an academic level, they asked the question, what does it mean practically? And that's where there was a Muhammad, it's like a Hagidveg in there. Go ahead, you wanted to say something. There was a hand raised in this neighborhood also. Nain? I saw a hand. I always tell my students, don't be afraid of me, I'm not worth it. If someone has anything to say, now's the time to talk. So I'm just going to read and translate and stop. I'm speaking almost an hour, okay? I'm just going to start. Vine. I gave you a Hagdama to this Perek using two forms. Form number one, before thought, after thought, and after speech. Form number 2, that Hashem creates space, and the space is filled with Him, and then He evacuates Him and leaves over space. And this brought about a big machlekes about the wording of the Arizal, between Chassidim and Misnagdim, which again, it's nothing new. The Shittas existed before the Baal Shem Tov, the Shittas existed before the Vilna Gaon, the Shittas before the Alter Rebbe. In other words, all of these Shittas were found in Mekubalim from the Sfarim before, but in Chassidus it became personal. It became a religious debate, and a faith debate. Midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the measure of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is Shalei Kibitas Basar, is different than a person. And the Alter Rebbe tells you his Shita. Sha'adam Kashem Adaber Dibur, when a person speaks, the air, the substance of the words are from his mouth. Who murgash venida are felt and are evident, are visible. Davar as a thing bifnei atzmeis by itself. Movdul mishar, it moves from its root. Shehein, that the root is eser b'chinas nefesh atzma, the fact of the person. When I speak, words go out of my mouth into a space where I am not. Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as opposed to the Eibishter, ein dibure moved many yizbarach as v'shalom. Even though the Chumash describes the event of creation as speech, and the phenomena of speech is he's placing it outside of him, when the Eibishter created the world through speech. In other words, when the Eibishter put the world outside of himself, he didn't really. It's dibur shalei k'pshutai, or tzimtzum shalei k'pshutai. Ki ein davar chutz mimenu. There's nothing outside of him. V'lei sasad, there is no space, ponim minei, which is vacant from him. Now when these words, v'lei sasad, ponim minei, there's a very big chiddush. And the chiddush is the word asad. Hashem doesn't have asad. Asad means mokum. Hashem creates mokum. And only when He creates mokum can you have even a concept of tzimtzum. So the Zayar already said, way before the Arizal, that there's a concept called asad, space, which is a chiddush lagabe atzmos, and leis asad ponim minei, the space which exists, which He created, is never empty from Him. V'lachein, which is why that ein dibure yizbarach, Hashem's speech is not ki dibureinu chas v'shalom, like our words. That kemei she'ein machshavtei machshavei sein, just like His thought is different than ours. And for this you have a right from a pasuk. Kidiksiv, as the pasuk says, kilei machshavei sein machshavei sein, my thoughts are different than yours. Now, dumb question. How is Hashem's thought different than ours? The answer is, our thought never creates anything. The Eibishter's thought creates. Says the Rebbe, Uksiv, it also says, Ken govu d'rochai b'darchechem v'geimes, so my ways are hard, your ways, which goes on speech. Now if you learn the Maimorim, in Samach Vav it's mentioned, that by people, sometimes speech is effective like an action. L'mashal, a king, b'dvar melech shilton, a king speaks and things happen. So it's not the same as machshav. The Eibishter's thought creates, our thought creates nothing. The Eibishter's speech creates, our speech, if you're a king, could be effective, but nevertheless they're different, but for a different reason. Not because people can't create through their speech, but people cannot create through their speech, and what they created should continue to be one with them, you see? But the Eibishter, his thought is different than ours. First of all, he could create and we can't. By speech, we could create through our speech, without melech shilton. The Eibishter creates through his speech, but we create separate from ourselves. And the Eibishter can do two opposites. Even though he's creating through speech, the speech is separate from him. Okay? V'lei nikra diburi yizbarach b'shem dibur. The only reason we call his speech, rach al derech moshe, by way of analogy, that it's revealed to us. And I'm going to stop here. We're going to take a break. We're going to do B'linei Yem Yem. And we're going to revisit this next Sunday. We'll learn it inside next week. Okay.